Welcome back to another video. Today we have some scary Reddit stories for you guys. If you guys have been enjoying the videos, make sure to like and subscribe, and let's get right into this first story. My dad grew up in a very small rural village in central Ohio during the 1980s. One winter night when he was a teenager, his mom picked him up from a late marching band event at his high school. They were driving home down a long, unlit road around 11 p.m., maybe closer to midnight. This was the kind of road that felt like it stretched on forever, with nothing but darkness and the occasional flicker of their headlights to break the monotony. On either side of the road, there were these deep, grassy ditches, probably about 4 feet down, and beyond those, miles and miles of flat cornfields. In the summer, the fields would be full of tall corn, but since it was the middle of the winter, the land was barren and lifeless, with nothing but the stubs of dead crops poking through the frozen ground. As they were driving, chatting quietly to fill the eerie silence, my dad suddenly went quiet. Up ahead, in the dim glow of the headlights, they saw a woman walking barefoot in the ditch along the side of the road. She was dressed only in a thin nightgown, which seemed bizarre given the freezing temperature. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the headlights, and she moved slowly, almost like she was in a trance. Neither my dad nor my grandma said anything at first, both trying to make sense of what they were seeing. My dad noticed how unkempt she looked. She looked like she had just rolled out of bed after being sick. Her hair was tangled and it was hanging around limply around her shoulders. But what really struck out to him was how empty she seemed, like she wasn't really there even though she was right in front of them. As they passed her, they both craned their necks to get a better look, but she never turned her head or made any sign that she noticed them. She just kept on walking, staring straight ahead into the darkness. By the time it registered how out of place she was, they had already driven past her. There wasn't a single house or building for miles, and they kept that uneasy pit in their stomachs, worrying about what that woman was actually doing, and she might have been in danger. They made a quick decision to turn around and go back to see if she needed help. My grandma turned around the car within a half mile and headed back towards where they had seen her. But when they reached the spot, the woman was gone. They drove up and down the stretch of road several times. The headlights were sweeping the ditches and looking for any signs of her, but there was nothing. They even pulled over, got out, and walked along the ditch, calling out into the cold, empty night. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. The fields were wide open, and in the moonlight you could see for miles. If she had run off, they would have spotted her, but it was like she had vanished into thin air. Dad remembers his heart beating out of his chest and being so scared he couldn't even think. My grandma, who was the practical one, tried to rationalize it, suggesting that the woman may have been sleepwalking and had hidden somewhere when she saw the car lights. But even though she was saying this, she couldn't quite shake the feeling of the wrongness that hung over it. They eventually gave up, unable to find any trace of the mysterious woman, and they drove home in silence. Both of them were absolutely haunted of what they had just seen. For years they wondered about that night. My dad is convinced that they encountered a ghost, or something otherworldly that they couldn't explain. My grandma, on the other hand, sticks it to her theory of an exceptional sleepwalker, though she even admits that it doesn't really add up. Who would be out there in the freezing cold, without any shoes or proper clothing, with no homes or buildings for miles? To this day, they both feel haunted by that encounter. My dad says he sometimes dreams about the woman, her pale, empty face staring at him from the side of the road, and he always wakes up with this sense of unease, like she's out there, wandering the fields looking for someone else to captivate. Whatever the truth is, they never found out, but every time my dad drives down a dark, empty road, he can't help but glance into the ditch, half expecting to see her again or see someone walking barefoot through the night. I work as a night shift nurse, so I'm used to driving at weird hours. I usually take the back roads to avoid traffic, and they're usually quicker. There's one road in particular that I take almost every night, a long, empty stretch that cuts through miles of farmland. It's isolated, sure, but it's also peaceful, or at least it was. A few weeks ago, I was driving home after a long shift. It was around 4 a.m. and I was absolutely exhausted. I just wanted to get home, shower, and collapse into bed. The road was empty like always, and I was zoned out just thinking about sleep. Then as I was driving, I saw a bright light in the rearview mirror. At first I thought it was another car, but it was way too bright, almost blinding. It got closer and closer, and then it was right behind me. I couldn't see who or what it was, just this intense white light flooding inside of my car. I slowed down hoping that they'd pass, but they didn't. They just stayed right on my tail, the light so bright that I could barely see behind me. I was freaking out, thinking about all those stories that you hear about people getting run off the road. I sped up, but so did they, matching my speed absolutely perfectly. I tried everything, speeding up, slowing down, even pulling over, but no matter what I did, they stayed right behind me, the light never dimming. I couldn't see their car, just this blinding white light. I don't know how long this went on for, but it felt like forever. I was losing it now, and my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I finally pulled over and I threw the car in park, ready to jump out and confront whatever was behind me. But as soon as I stopped, the light disappeared, just blinked out like it had never been there. I sat there and I was just staring at the empty road behind me, wondering what that was. There was nothing though. No car, no light, just nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down, and I pulled back onto the road. I figured maybe I was just tired and seeing things now. I kept driving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was completely off. I should have been home by now, but the road kept going. It was almost like it was stretching out in front of me, like something you would see out of a movie. I checked the clock and it was around 4:15 a.m. I had been driving for around an hour, but I still wasn't home. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't turn around, I couldn't stop. I just kept driving and I had my eyes locked on the road. Then I saw something in the distance. It was a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down and I was squinting to see what it could have been. As I got closer, I realized it was a person, standing there with their back to me. They were dressed in dark clothes and their hair was long and matted, like they hadn't ever showered. I stopped the car. I didn't want to get out, but I had to. I opened the door and I stepped out with my legs shaking. I felt like I was gonna fall. "Hey," I called out. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't move. I took a few steps closer and I said, "Do you need any help?" They turned around slowly and I absolutely just froze. It was a woman. She had a pale face and her eyes were wide with fear. She didn't say anything, she just stared at me like she was seeing a ghost. Then she opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She just mouthed something over and over. The thing I saw her saying was, "Turn around." I didn't understand at first, but then it hit me. She was telling me to turn around, to go back. I nodded and I stumbled my way back to the car. My hands were fumbling with my keys and it took me forever to actually get my car started up. I glanced back at her, but she was gone. Just gone, like no one had ever been there. I didn't waste any time, so I threw the car into reverse and floored it, spinning around and heading back the way I came. I didn't look back, I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of the main road up ahead. I don't know what happened or who that woman was, but I haven't taken that road ever since. I found a longer, safer route home. And even though it adds an hour to my drive, I don't care. Some things just aren't worth the risk. And whatever was on that road that night, I'm not going back to find out. I still don't know if I was tired or if something was really there, but all I know is that I never want to experience what I experienced that night. I'm a long-haul truck driver, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road, but this one still messes with my head. I was on a run through the Midwest, hauling a load of machinery from Kansas to Montana. It's a long trip, so I usually break it up with some quick naps at the rest stops or truck stops. This time, I was running a bit behind, so I decided to drive through the night and sleep when I got closer to the destination. It was around 3 a.m. when I spotted him. A hitchhiker on the side of the road, thumb out, walking slowly along the shoulder. Now, I normally don't pick up hitchhikers, especially not in the middle of nowhere, but there was something about this guy that made me slow down and take a closer look. He looked young, maybe early 20s, with a scruffy beard and a worn-out jacket. His backpack looked heavy and he seemed tired. For some reason, I felt bad for him. Maybe it was the way he looked at me as I passed by, like he really needed help. Against my better judgment, I pulled over a little ways ahead and I waited for him to catch up. He jogged up to my truck and I rolled down the window. "Where you headed?" "North," he said. "As far as you can take me." I hesitated for a second and proceeded to let him hop in. He climbed into the passenger seat, making me think profusely. I noticed that he had this old army duffel bag with him, and he always kept it close to his feet. He didn't say much after that. He just sat quietly and stared out the window. I tried to make some small talk, but he only gave short one-word answers. After about an hour, I glanced over at him and he started to doze off, head resting against the window. I figured I'd let him sleep. He looked like he really needed it. We were somewhere in Wyoming by then, the highway empty except for my rig in the darkness. That's when I saw him again. A hitchhiker standing on the side of the road, thumb out, looking exactly like the guy standing next to me. I slammed on the brakes at this point, freaking out, and I looked over at the passenger seat. He was gone and the seat was empty. I stared at the road and my mind began to just run. Had I just imagined this whole thing? Was I more tired than I thought? I pulled over to the side and got out, walking around the truck, but there was no sign of him anywhere. I felt like I was losing my mind now. I got back in the truck and I tried to shake it off. Maybe I just nodded off for a second and had some weird dream. I started driving again, keeping my eyes peeled out for any more strange sights. About 30 minutes later, I saw him again, the same hitchhiker, in the same spot, doing the same thing. I didn't stop this time. I floored it, glancing at the passenger seat every few seconds to make sure it was still empty, which it of course was. The rest of the drive was a blur. I kept seeing him every few miles, standing on the side of the road, always looking at me with that same tired expression that I remember. I tried to ignore him, but it was hard. I even turned on the radio to drown out the silence, but nothing helped. I was really freaking out. I finally made it to a rest stop just before sunrise and I pulled in, shaking like a leaf. I parked the truck, turned off the engine, and just sat there trying to calm down. That's when I noticed it. The duffel bag. It was on the floor of the passenger side where he'd left it. I grabbed it intending to throw it out, but something stopped me. I opened it up and inside there were a few clothes, some toiletries, and an old worn out photo. It was of the young guy in an army uniform, smiling with a couple of his buddies. I don't know what happened that night, and I don't know who that hitchhiker was or why he kept on showing up. I left the duffel bag at the stop and I got back on the road, not looking back or even questioning what had happened. I've been driving for years now, and I've never seen anything like that. Sometimes when I'm on a long stretch of highway, I always think about him and think if he's still out there. I don't know if it was a spirit or what it could have been, but I hope none of you ever have to encounter what I saw that night. About a year ago, I was driving from my home in San Diego to visit some family in Arizona. I like to drive at night because there's less traffic and I find it kind of peaceful. I had work that day, so leaving late was my only option. Anyway, it was around 2 a.m. and I was on this long stretch of highway. There were miles of nothing but desert around me. The kind of place where your phone signal is as dead as the landscape around you. As I'm driving, I see this man standing by the side of the road. My first instinct was to keep driving. You hear all these horror stories about people getting robbed, or worse, when they stop to help strangers in the middle of nowhere. But then I thought, what if this guy really needed help? What if his car broke down and he was stranded out here? So against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over a few feet ahead of him. He jogged up to my window and I could see him more clearly in the glow of my headlights. He looked normal enough, late 30s, scruffy beard, wearing a hoodie and jeans. But there was something off about his eyes, like they were too wide, too intense. "Hey man, can you give me a ride to the next gas station?" he asked. My car broke down just a few miles back. I looked at him and then glanced around. There was no car in sight, and I mean nothing, just empty highway stretching for miles. "Where's your car?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He pointed back behind him in the direction I had just come from. "It's back there around the bend. It's pretty hard to see from here." Something didn't feel right. Maybe it was his eyes or the fact that I hadn't seen any cars broken down on this road for the past hour. I told him I'd give him a ride to the gas station, but that he had to show me where his car was first. If it wasn't there, no deal. He hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, okay, fair enough. We got in the car and I turned around, heading back in the direction that I had come from. I drove slowly, keeping my eyes peeled for his car, but there was nothing. I glanced over at him and he was staring straight ahead, absolutely expressionless. Are you sure it's this way? I asked, feeling more uneasy by the second. Yeah, just keep going. After about 5 minutes, I was done. Listen, man, I don't see your car. I think I'm just gonna drop you at the gas station and be on my way. He didn't say anything for a moment and then nodded. Yeah, okay, that's fine. I was relieved, honestly. I turned the car around again and I started driving towards the nearest gas station that I knew of. It was still about 30 miles away, but it could have been farther. He didn't say anything for the rest of the ride. He just stared out the window with this blank look on his face. We finally pulled up to the gas station, and as he got out, he turned and looked at me with that same wide-eyed stare. Thanks for the ride, man, but you should be careful out there. There are some real weirdos on these roads. I forced a smile, nodded, and began to drive off. I watched him in my rearview mirror for a bit, just standing there watching me drive away. I didn't think much about it after that, just a weird creepy encounter that I had. But about 20 minutes later, I saw something that made me absolutely freak out. There on the side of the road was the same guy, wearing the same clothes, standing in the same way, waving his arms at me again. I sped up and didn't look back. I have no idea how he got there or if it was the same person. I just know that I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I drove straight to my family's house without stopping again, and I have never taken that route since. Whatever I saw was enough to keep me off that highway for good. Last summer, my buddies and I decided to take a road trip from Colorado to Nevada. We're a group of thrill seekers, always looking for the next adventure. We had no real plan, just a car full of camping gear, some snacks, and the open road ahead of us. It was supposed to be a fun, spontaneous trip, but it turned into something I'll never forget. We were somewhere in Utah, on one of those back roads that GPS only half-heartedly recognizes. We saw a sign for a town called Elm Springs. None of us had ever heard of it, and we've been all over this area before. The sign looked old, like it hadn't been replaced in decades, but it kind of piqued our curiosity. We figured it would be a cool little detour, maybe check out an abandoned town or something like that. We turned off the main road and we decided to follow the sign. The road was narrow and winding, and it was surrounded by this dense forest. After about 20 minutes, we came to a clearing and saw it. It was the town of Elm Springs. It looked like something out of a movie set. There was a small main street with a few old buildings, a general store, a diner, and a couple of houses. Everything was weathered and overgrown, like it had been abandoned for years. But the weird thing was, it didn't look completely deserted. There were a few cars parked in front of some of the buildings, and we could see people walking around. We pulled up and parked the car, and as soon as we got out, we noticed something was off. It was the people. There weren't many, maybe a dozen or so, and they all stopped and looked at us at the same time. It was very unnerving. They just stood there, staring, like we were intruding or something. One of my friends, Jake, waved and called out, "Hey, we're just passing through, thought we'd check out the town." Nobody answered and they just kept staring. We exchanged these uneasy glances, but decided to explore the town a bit. We walked down the main street, peeking into windows. The general store looked like it hadn't been stocked in years, and dust covered absolutely everything. The diner had plates of food on the tables, but they were covered in mold like they had been there for decades. It was creepy, but we were curious, so we kept on looking around. That's when we noticed the people again. They were all standing on the street now, watching us silently, not moving. It was like something out of a horror movie. We decided we'd seen enough and we started to head back to the car. But when we got in and tried to start it, nothing happened. The engine wouldn't even turn over. We tried everything, but the car was dead and we were stuck now. We got out and started walking, thinking we'd try to find someone to help us, but the people were gone. The street was empty. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees, and it was like this whole town had vanished. We were getting pretty freaked out at this point, but there was no way except back the way we came. We started walking down the road that we'd driven in on, but after what felt like an hour, we ended up back in the town. It didn't make any sense. We hadn't turned or anything, just walked straight, but somehow we were right back where we started. Panic began to set in, and we tried leaving again, but the same thing happened. No matter which way we went, we always ended up back in the same town. It was almost like the town was following us. It was getting dark, and we were terrified. We decided to hold up in one of the abandoned houses for the night and decided that we'd figure things out in the morning. We barely slept, and we just sat there with our backs against the walls, watching the windows and waiting for something to happen. When the sun came up, we tried leaving again. This time, the people were back, standing in the middle of the street watching us. We didn't even bother talking to them. We just ran, not caring which direction, just running as fast as we could. Somehow we had made it out. We burst through the trees and onto the main road, gasping for air now. We flagged down a car, and the driver, he was an old guy. He looked at us like we were crazy when we told him where we'd been. Elm Springs, he said, shaking his head. The town's been gone for over 50 years. It burned down in the 60s. There's nothing there. We tried to argue to tell him that we had seen, the town and the people, but he just looked at us like we had gone crazy. He gave us a ride to the nearest town, and we called a tow truck to get our car. When we went back to get it, the road to Elm Springs was gone. It was just trees and overgrowth where the turnoff had been. I don't know what happened that day, and I don't want to know. We made an agreement to never go back, and we've kept it since that day. I've talked to many people, even psychologists, and they think that we might have encountered some spiritual void. They think that, for some reason, everything lined up and we were all able to see into the spiritual world that no one else could see in. I sometimes feel like I can see into the supernatural, and I think that after that night, there might have been a curse over me and my friends. I hope you guys can relate to this, and maybe you guys know some stories that relate to this. That is going to be the end of the video, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed these stories. I had a fun time making these, and let me know what you guys want to see next. I appreciate all the support. You guys have really been killing it. Make sure to like and subscribe for more videos and turn on those notifications because I'm going to be cranking out content in the next few months for you guys. So let's get it. Let's hit that goal. See you guys.